All right, welcome back. And today we are going to talk more about lists. And this time, instead of me teaching you, we are going to actually just do some problems together. And what have we learned so far? We learned about control flow, if-else statements, and we've learned about simple loops, the while loop. We have also learned about lists and how to access them, add elements into a list, remove elements into a list. So we are going to use the things that we learned to write some simple functions. It's a good exercise and we should do it. So the first one is problem 1. It says write a function that prints each element in the list on a separate line. So looking at this problem, we know that we have a parameter list, and then what we can do is we can print things because that's what we want to do, because we want to print each element in the list on a separate line. Now here's an example. If you call print list on a list that is 1, 2, 3, it's going to print 1, 2, 3 on separate lines. So in case you don't know what this is actually just a comment. So you know how the hashtag gives you a comment? Well, if you do triple quotes, this is actually a comment box also. Instead of me having to write hashtag every time I want to write a comment in a new line, I could just do triple quote, and then anything in between this will be a comment, and it will not affect my program. For example, if I run, it will not say that there's an error. If I take off these quotes and I run it, then it says invalid syntax because this doesn't make any sense. So yeah, so these are comments. So how do we write this function? So first you have to print stuff. Okay, got it. So I have to print something for sure. And then we have to iterate on the list, meaning that if I have a list 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I want to do something such that I can go look at 1, access 2, and then access 3. So remember, how do we iterate on something? You can use a while loop, okay? And also, how do you access something on a list? You give it an index. So for example, let's just say I want to print the 0 index of the list. Let's see what happens. So actually, let's just go on this side. I'm gonna define list as 1, 2, 3. This is just for testing. So if I do 0, it's gonna print 1. If I print 1, it's gonna print the second one. And then if I put 2, it's gonna print the third one. So now that we know this, how do we actually print it? As you know, when I'm just accessing these values, I'm not actually printing it. So technically, you have to print it like this. This is actually printing, because right now we're just returning the value, but I want to actually print it. Okay, so I want to print that, but I want to print all of them. So technically, it should look like this. Print 0, 1, 3. Oops, I meant 2. So I want to iterate over this. So how would I do that? Well, first, there's a while loop, okay? And a great thing to do with while loop is to define an index. We'll start at 0. And then what we want to do is we want to have a while loop. And then we want to loop through the whole list. So how will we do that? So how you can do that is you can have a while loop while what? While I is smaller than the length of list. Okay? I'll tell you why. Because the strategy here is that we know our list has 3 elements. Okay? And then the length of the list is 3 because we have 3 elements on the list. So if I want to do something on the list, how many times? How many times would I want to do it? I want to do something for 1, I want to do something for 2, and I want to do something for 3. So I'm going to repeat the function print 3 times. So what we want to do is we want a while loop that iterates over the list. And how would we do that is that we would define an index which equals to 0. And then first, we're going to access the list at 0. And then we're going to print 1. So we're going to print list 1. And then what we want to do is we want to access the second index. So we will define I as 1. So now if we print list I, it becomes 2. And then when I becomes 2, and I do the same operation, it's gonna become 3. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna iterate through the list by having an index equals to 0, and then it's gonna add 1 every time we loop through it, okay? And then that's pretty much it. So let's just print I for now and see what happens. What do you think would happen? What what's going to be printed here? Print list one, let's say 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. I have 4 elements. What is it going to print? It's going to print 0, 1, 2, 3. Why? The length of the list is 4 because we have 4 elements. And then each time we iterate, the I becomes bigger until I is equal to the length of list. So that means every iteration, I'm going to print I. So one way to think about it is I equals 0. While I is smaller than the length of list, is 0 smaller than 4? Yes, it is. Okay, I'll print it. And then I'll also add 1. Now I becomes 1. Is 1 smaller than 4? Yes, it is. Okay, good. So this statement is still true. So I'll print it and I'll add 1 again. Now I becomes 2. Is 2 smaller than list of length of list? Yes, it is. It's smaller than 4. Then, okay, I'm going to print I, which is 2, and then I'm going to add 1 again. Now it's 3. Is 3 smaller than a list, which is 4? Yes, it is. I'll print 3, and then I plus 1, and then that will become 4. Now I equals 4. Is 4 smaller than 4? No, it is not. So because it's not smaller than 4, this becomes false. Once it becomes false, we will go here, and then we'll say done, for example. So then it will break out of this loop, and it would go here. Anything that's indented will be inside this while loop. And then because this is not indented, it means that's after the while loop. Okay, so now we want to actually print the element of the list. So there's only one small change that we want to do. How do we access the value in a list? We give it an index. Well, that's great because here I is actually the same thing as the index because the index starts at 0 and then we iterate, we add 1 to I every time. That's basically the index. And it'll never go too far because we say that once I is equal to the length of the list, then we stop doing it. So here we can just print the ith element of the list. All right, so let's try this again. Print list 2, 2, 2, 3. Nice, it prints 2, 2, 2, 2, 3. All right, excellent. So we don't need this. So we could try it again, print list. What would happen if I give it an empty list? It's gonna give nothing. 2, 3, 6, 3, 4, 6. You got 3, 4, 6. Great, so that was pretty good. Now let's try another one. Write a function that outputs a list of numbers from 0 to n. So for example, if you write list numbers 5, it's gonna output 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you write list 0, it's gonna output 0. All right, cool, cool, cool. So this will be a little bit funky because usually when it's n, it outputs number from 0 to n minus 1. That's just conventional. But I'm gonna do something a little bit different where I want you to output 1 more. So as you can see, n is 5, but I output 6 numbers because I'm including the 0. So how are we gonna do that? So remember how to use a while loop. We usually have an index 0. There's 3 components that's important. The index, where you define what it is, like you initiate your variable, and then you have the while loop, you have the condition, and then you also have the increment, right? Most while loops are always like that. You always have a variable, you have a statement of when to stop, and then you have an increment, right? Remember those 3 things whenever you write while loops. Because imagine if I don't have this, imagine if I forgot to increment. What is gonna happen if I print a list? It's gonna stay in the loop forever because I is always gonna be 0. And because it's always gonna be 0, it's always gonna be smaller than 3, which is the length of my list. And then it's always gonna print. Look, see? Look at my scroll bar. It keeps printing. So if ever this happens to you, press Control C to stop it. That's how you get out of an infinite loop. So let's add this again, very important. All right, so here, how do I list numbers? Well, first, let's write a loop. Let's do I equals 0, that's our initial variable. And then we have the while loop, and I want a condition. I want I to be smaller than n. Or, okay, so if it's I equals smaller than n, that means if n was 5, there's gonna be, how many iteration will I have? I will have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, not 5 because 5 is not smaller than n, but I do want to print 5 also. So maybe I have to do something different here. I'll do smaller n equal to, so that 5 is equal to 5. So yes, 5 is not smaller than 5, but 5 is still equal than 5, and I'll still output that number. Okay, but then this time you're not printing, you're actually getting a list. You want to return a list of number. So how will we do that? So what we can do is create a new list, and we will initialize it to be an empty list. Okay, and then each time I iterate, what do I want to do? I want to add an element to the list. So we remember how to do that? It's called append. So what would I append? I'll append I, because I starts at 0, which is what we want, and then each time we go to the while loop, we increment 1. Oh, that's a good idea. We're gonna increment by 1 so that we don't have an infinite loop. So we're gonna increment by 1, so then each time we go through this loop, we're gonna append I. I starts at 0, and every time I go through this loop, I increases by 1, and then I'm gonna append it. So it starts at 0, I append it, and then it's 1, I append it, 2, I append it. That's great, it seems like it works. And then last thing, don't forget, because this function, we actually want to output something, we're not printing anything, we're actually outputting something. We're going to return the new list that we created. All right, let's see if this works. Nice, excellent. It works perfectly. Yeah, so in case you're still confused about print versus output, the best way to do it is by assigning a variable. So output actually returns something that you're able to use. Printing, you can't use it anymore. It's actually just a side effect. It just prints on your screen. Here's the best example. I'll name a variable called variable1, and whatever that returns from this function will become variable1. Okay, so what is variable1? I'm gonna print it. It's a whole list. Great. Okay, and what type is it? It's a list. Okay, cool. But then if I do variable1 equals our previous function, which is print list, and then we add a list here, 2, 3, 4, what's gonna happen? It's still gonna print because printing is a side effect. And then in this function, we don't return anything. So var1, what is this going to be? It's probably gonna be nothing, right? There we go, it's nothing. So what's the type of this variable? It's nothing, it's none type. All right, because we're not actually returning anything in this function. We're not returning anything tangible. If I return 5, for example, and I do variable1 equals to print list, and then 2, 3, 4, it's still going to print, but I returned 5. So what is var1 gonna be? It's gonna be 5, because that's what I returned. It's tangible. Okay, cool. Anyways, back to list numbers. So list numbers, I think we already completed it. Yeah, we already completed it. If we do 10, then it's a list of 10 items. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's try 0, and then that works too. All right, so here we go. Here's how you can merge what you learned about lists and what you learned about while loops together. And actually we didn't do any if-else statement, but it should be pretty obvious how to use if-else statements. I guess we could modify this function to do something funky. What if we only want to output even numbers? Okay, so here, I don't want this to be the answer anymore. I want it to be like that. I want to output everything, all the numbers until that number, but only even numbers. How would I do that? Well, I could do a control flow where I only append if it's an even number. How would I do that? So I could write an if statement. If I modulo 2 equals 0, that means the number is even. Why? Because it's divisible by 2. Then what would I do? I would append the item onto your list. And then I need to delete this one because I don't want to append it twice. And also I only want to append it if this statement is true, right? So what happens now is that I'm still going to loop here 5 times, but I'm only going to append the item to the list if this is true. And this is true half the time, only for even numbers. Let's try this again. List numbers 10. Aha, see what I did here? I have outputted a list that only contains even numbers. All right, so that's pretty much it for this video. I hope this exercise was good. Feel free to write your own functions with what you've learned. It's always good to just learn by trying, learn by practicing. So try to be creative. Think of ways that you can automate something using functions, like for example, calculate your taxes, or adding all your grocery items and then calculating the tips for it and stuff like that. Imagine if you have a list of costs or like a list of food items that you want to buy, and then you want to quickly calculate the sum and the tax and the tips that you should pay. Try that out, and yeah, be creative, and I'll see you in the next one.